February 15th, 1898, 9:40 p.m., Havana Harbor. A U.S. warship sits at anchor in dark water, its lights small against the Cuban shoreline. The men aboard are not in formation. There is no ceremony. The evening is ordinary enough that it barely registers as history until the sound arrives as rupture, not warning. The blast tears open the forward part of the ship. Heat, metal, smoke. In minutes, the main is no longer a vessel with a mission. It is debris, bodies, and a question that cannot be answered fast enough to satisfy distance. By morning, the event has already moved, not by ship, by wire and print. Across American cities, the machinery of attention begins to turn the way it always does when a nation is presented with an injury. Telegraph operators transcribe fragments. Editors compress uncertainty into sentences that fit a column. Compositors lock type into frames. Presses hammer ink into paper with the steady violence of industry. When the bundles leave the building, they do not carry only information. They carry mood. They carry permission, what to fear, what to demand, who to blame. Some newspapers seize the gap between what is known and what can be made compelling. A slogan forms, clean enough to memorize, sharp enough to repeat. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. A phrase that spreads because it is not an explanation. It is a direction. This is the environment William Randolph Hearst had spent years preparing to exploit. The late 19th century city where news is a commodity, outrage is a renewable resource, and circulation is a scoreboard. He had already learned in San Francisco what happens when a paper stops behaving like a record and starts behaving like a weapon. In 1887, at 23, he put his name on the masthead of the San Francisco Examiner as proprietor, the first public sign that the inheritance would not be passive. And when he bought a failing New York paper in 1895, he didn't simply enter journalism. He entered scale, the only condition under which a country's mind can be pushed, pulled, and exhausted on schedule. What looks from a distance like one man controlling America's mind begins somewhere colder and more practical, in the systems that made mass persuasion cheap, fast, and repeatable. Start the next portion, but don't include the source's reference at the end, because I will directly copy it and give it voiceover. Background of the story. October 18th, 1884, 7:15 a.m., a street corner in Lower Manhattan. Men in work coats unfold thin sheets of paper as they walk. Some stop under awnings, some keep moving, reading in pieces. Headlines first, then the first paragraph, then whatever fits before the next block. The paper is not a luxury item. It is priced like a habit. The city is already built to receive it. That is the first condition of mass influence in the United States of the late 19th century. A population dense enough that information can be sold by the 100,000 every day without traveling far. Between 1870 and 1900, American cities swell with people and factories and new routines. Streets become schedules, commutes become crowds, crowds become markets, and markets demand constant signals, prices, scandals, speeches, murders, elections, weather, war rumors. The newspaper fits perfectly into that new urban metabolism because it is small, portable, and daily. It arrives with the same reliability as wages and streetcars. But density alone isn't enough. Influence requires speed. By the 1870s and 1880s, the telegraph has already reshaped what news means. A fire in Chicago, a strike in Pennsylvania, a bank failure in New Orleans, these are no longer local events that travel at the pace of trains and letters. They become national raw material within hours. The wire turns geography into something thinner. It doesn't erase distance. It disciplines it. Then comes the second condition, standardization. A newspaper is not only writing, it is logistics. Paper supply, ink, typesetting, printing, bundling, distribution routes, street sales, home delivery lists, ad contracts, collection of payments, accounting. By the 1880s, the industry is increasingly industrial, in the literal sense. It looks less like a salon of editors and more like a factory that happens to ship words. Typesetting is one of the major choke points in that factory. For much of the century, setting a page means setting it by hand, letter by letter, line by line, work that is slow, specialized, and expensive. The breakthrough comes when composition itself becomes mechanized. By the late 1880s, the linotype system is spreading through major newspapers, turning the pace of typesetting into something that can keep up with a daily urban appetite. The paper can grow in size without growing proportionally in labor time. More pages become feasible. More headlines can exist. More events can be manufactured into significance. Then comes the third condition: cheap paper. The 19th century is also the story of pulp. As publishers shift away from rag-based paper toward wood pulp processes, the per-copy cost drops. This matters more than ideology. It changes what can be sold and at what price. A lower cover price expands the audience downward and outward. It pulls in readers who do not buy books, who do not belong to clubs, who do not have time for long-form argument. When print becomes cheap enough, a paper can survive on scale, selling huge circulation at thin margins while making money elsewhere, which leads to the fourth condition: advertising. In the older model, papers rely heavily on subscriptions and political patronage. In the newer model, the paper becomes a platform, an attention engine, then sells access to that attention. Department stores, railroads, patent medicines, clothing sellers, entertainment venues, brokers. They buy space not because they respect journalism, but because the paper is where the crowd already is. Advertising makes mass readership economically valuable, which means mass readership becomes the target, which means content is engineered to pull it in. A subtle change occurs here, quiet, structural, and permanent. The newspaper stops being primarily a civic document for a narrow literate class and becomes a competitive product in a crowded market. Once the product is attention, the incentives become clear. The paper must be readable quickly. It must feel urgent. It must produce emotion that keeps the reader from putting it down. It must be discussed, repeated, argued over. In that environment, truth is not abolished. It is simply forced into a contest with what sells faster. Now add the fifth condition: distribution networks. A paper printed in the early morning has only a few hours to become the day's version of reality. It must leave the press room, move through wholesalers, reach street sellers, arrive at train stations, be carried into workplaces, show up on doorsteps, land on counters in restaurants and barber shops. Railroads and urban delivery systems make this possible. So does the sheer physical reorganization of cities. Grid streets, numbered addresses, standardized routes. A newspaper empire is not only editorial dominance, it is the ability to move paper like freight with minimal friction. And layered over all of this is a sixth condition, often overlooked: routine literacy. By the end of the 19th century, basic reading is common enough in American cities that the newspaper becomes a daily tool. Not everyone reads the full paper. Many never will. But they can read the headline, they can read the caption, they can read the first paragraph. In a mass market, that is sufficient. Because the headline is not a summary, it is a command. It tells you what to carry into the day. This is also the era when the boundary between public and private life starts to thin. A political speech is no longer something you have to attend to experience. A scandal is no longer limited to the neighborhood where it occurred. A trial becomes entertainment. A foreign crisis becomes personal. Newspapers bring distant institutions into the breakfast table. In doing so, they change what national identity feels like. A nation is not only laws and borders, it is a shared set of stories told in the same 24-hour cycle. The paper becomes the mediator between the individual and the country. That mediation creates a form of power that does not look like power at first. It does not require uniforms. It does not require office. It does not require the public to agree with every word. It only requires repetition, availability, and a sense that the paper is the place where reality is officially announced. By the 1890s, all the raw components are in place: mechanized production, cheaper materials, mass advertising, fast transmission, urban density, and a population trained to consume a daily narrative. What remains is the arena where these systems collide most violently, where publishers can test in real time how far emotion can be pushed before it becomes policy. That arena is New York, May 10th, 1895, 5:30 a.m., Park Row, Manhattan. The street is already awake, not in the way churches wake a town or factories wake a district. This is a different kind of labor. Boys with stacks of papers under their arms move in quick loops. Men shout headlines like challenges. The air smells of damp stone, coal smoke, and ink that hasn't fully dried. Across a few blocks, multiple newsrooms are doing the same thing at the same time, compressing the night into a product that must win the morning. New York does not merely host newspapers in the 1890s, it weaponizes them. The city is an ecosystem of immigrant neighborhoods. Finance houses, docks, courts, theaters, police stations, tenements, and newly electrified commercial streets. It is crowded enough that each edition can find tens of thousands of readers within walking distance. It is competitive enough that a rival paper can steal those readers by changing a single variable: price, layout, tone, or speed. And it is unequal enough that stories of wealth and punishment, scandal and upward mobility feel like a daily referendum on who belongs. In this market, the newspaper is not an accessory to public life. It is part of the city's infrastructure, like transit, water, and light. It tells you what matters before you've had time to decide. By the mid-1890s, the 1-cent paper has become more than a pricing strategy. It's a promise. The news is for everyone, every day, cheaply. But a cent doesn't cover the true cost of printing. That gap is the central tension of the industry. To survive, a paper must do two things at once. First, it must sell an immense quantity of copies, circulation measured in the hundreds of thousands. Second, it must monetize the crowd through advertising. This arrangement quietly changes the moral center of journalism. When revenue depends on attention at scale, the paper begins to resemble the stage more than the courthouse. Even when reporting is accurate, it is framed for impact. Even when facts are present, they are arranged to produce sensation. New York is where those incentives become extreme. Because New York is where the nation's attention is already concentrated: financial markets, national politicians passing through, immigrant arrivals, and a constant churn of public spectacle. If you can dominate New York print, you can project into the country's nervous system. That is why the city produces a particular style of journalism in this period, one that becomes shorthand in American memory. Stories that are oversized, emotionally sharpened, and designed to be consumed fast. Long, sober explanation is a luxury. Impact is the currency. The format evolves around that need. Headlines grow larger, columns become easier to scan, illustrations multiply. Human tragedy is treated as narrative fuel. Criminal cases are written like serial drama. Society gossip becomes a map of status for readers who will never enter those rooms. Foreign conflicts become moral fables simplified for breakfast. And beneath the surface, the paper becomes an instrument for something deeper than readership. It becomes a mechanism for defining reality on a schedule. In earlier decades, people might argue about politics in taverns or churches with limited shared information. In New York of the 1890s, arguments increasingly begin with the same printed stimulus. People are not just forming opinions, they are reacting to a common daily script. That daily script is produced by organizations that understand, at a granular level, how the public consumes. Many readers do not finish articles. Many remember only the headline and the first sentences. Many trust repetition more than proof. Many confuse familiarity with truth. A newspaper does not need to convince everyone. It needs to set the terms of what everyone is talking about. This is the crucial shift. The paper stops being only a messenger and becomes a planner of attention. It decides what enters the public mind, how large it appears, how long it stays, and what emotional posture the audience should assume toward it. New York's circulation wars intensify these dynamics. Publishers fight not only over stories, but over how stories are presented. Who prints first? Who prints loudest? Who prints with the most emotional charge? They poach staff. They fund investigative efforts and publicity stunts. They treat rivals as enemies. The newsroom becomes a battlefield where the objective is not simply accuracy, but dominance. The people caught inside this system, reporters, artists, printers, carriers, are workers in an industry whose product is national mood. This is also where another critical element enters: the personality of the publisher. In many cities, papers are political machines aligned with parties. In New York, papers can become personal empires. When a publisher has the capital to sustain losses long enough to win circulation, he can treat the paper like a lever, pulling markets, reputations, elections, and public emotions. The paper becomes a kind of private government operating inside public life. William Randolph Hearst arrives in this environment with unusual advantages. He is not starting from the street. He is arriving with resources, ambition, and a sense that news is not merely information, but force. He has already seen how a newspaper can be used to punish enemies, elevate allies, and define the moral boundaries of a city. And he understands something that many respectable publishers resist admitting: the public does not consume news as a legal brief. It consumes news as story. Conflict, fear, hope, resentment, triumph. In 1895, when he buys a New York paper, he steps into the most sensitive part of America's attention economy and begins to run it like a campaign. Not a campaign for office, at first. A campaign for the right to tell the nation what its own reality means. And once a newspaper empire learns it can create that meaning at scale, it does not stay confined to headlines. It reaches outward into syndication, wire services, political pressure, celebrity culture, and eventually into the architecture of personal rule that tries to make influence feel permanent. Because in the logic of this era, money can build a mansion, but mass attention can build a country's mood, and Hearst is about to attempt both. It is not necessary to start every portion with exact date and time. I just asked in a hook. Whenever you feel there is need, you can start, but it's not a strict rule: start next. Hearst's power was never only a voice. It was a network. A newspaper's influence depends on what happens after the headline is written, how fast it is printed, how widely it is distributed, how consistently it arrives, and how many times the same narrative is repeated across different cities until it feels like the country itself is speaking. By the early 20th century, the ambition shifts from owning a paper to owning a system. One paper can win a morning, a network can hold a decade. The mechanics are unromantic. Printing plants, supply contracts for paper and ink, urban delivery routes that treat neighborhoods like scheduled territory, rail logistics that move bundles overnight, telegraph access that pulls distant events into local editions, editorial rooms that learn to write for mass consumption. What matters is not just what is true. What matters is what is available everywhere at once. That is why syndication and news services become crucial. If a Hearst story can appear in many places, shaped with the same tone, the same language, the same moral framing, then the public stops experiencing it as one publisher's opinion and begins experiencing it as the environment. This is how attention turns into governance without calling itself government. A national mood does not require universal agreement. It requires common exposure. It requires that even those who distrust the paper still must respond to it because everyone else is talking about it. In this period, Hearst moves toward that kind of structural presence. expanding beyond single mastheads toward a wider communications lattice. Influence becomes less about editorial brilliance and more about capacity, the ability to manufacture urgency every day and deliver it to millions. The result is a form of power that feels strangely modern, not command and control, but agenda and atmosphere. A paper cannot force you to vote a certain way, but it can decide what you fear, what you resent, what you consider scandal, and what you consider normal. It can decide what occupies your mind before your day begins. And once a system can do that consistently, the publisher no longer needs to persuade through argument. He can persuade through repetition, saturation, and timing, making some ideas feel inevitable simply because they are everywhere. The public imagines media empires as money-printing machines. In the circulation wars, they are often money-burning machines, at least at first. To dominate a mass market, a paper must expand faster than its profits. It must hire more reporters, more editors, more artists. It must pay for wire access. It must print more pages. It must run promotions. It must absorb losses long enough to outlast competitors who cannot sustain the same pace. This is where inheritance matters, not as comfort, but as runway. The 1-cent newspaper model creates a paradox. The cheaper the paper, the larger the audience, and the larger the ad revenue potential, but the greater the operational risk. A single misjudgment in circulation can turn a day's printing into expensive waste. A downturn in ad spending can collapse the entire balance sheet. So the paper is always hungry, always demanding new attention, new outrage, new novelty. The newsroom becomes less like a library and more like a furnace. It consumes events and turns them into emotional heat. In this environment, controlling America's mind is not a poetic phrase. It has a budget. It is paid for in paper tonnage and press maintenance, in overtime wages for printers, in telegraph fees, in the steady cost of keeping the machine louder than the competition. And because the paper's true product is attention, wealth begins to operate in a specific way, not just funding journalism, but purchasing dominance. When Hearst enters New York, he is not simply buying a platform. He is buying a fight, one that will require spending beyond reason to win. The objective is not to be profitable immediately. The objective is to be unavoidable. A mass circulation news empire depends on two streams that feel endless, advertising and appetite. And the Great Depression reduces both. Advertising contracts thin out. Department stores bargain down rates or vanish entirely. Whole categories of spending, luxury, travel, entertainment contract, and the newspaper, which sells access to consumer desire, begins losing the very fuel that makes its scale affordable. At the same time, the empire's expenses do not shrink on their own. Printing plants still require labor. Distribution still requires routes. Newsprint still arrives as a bill. A large staff is not a switch you flip off without consequence. And Hearst's operation is not one company with one balance sheet. It is a complex structure of holdings, papers, magazines, syndication, radio interests, real estate, motion picture ventures, each with its own needs, debts, and obligations, all tied together by the logic that scale itself is the asset. In 1935, his holdings are consolidated under the name American Newspapers, Inc. The consolidation signals size, but it also hints at a deeper necessity, the difference between an empire that can be managed casually and an empire that now requires financial engineering just to stay upright. Because Hearst is not only paying for journalism, he is paying for the outward form of dominance. His personal spending reaches levels that are almost abstract, figures in the millions each year. His properties are not merely residences, they are institutions with staff, maintenance, repairs, and constant new work. His collecting is not a pastime, it is acquisition at industrial scale. He buys art, antiques, furniture, tapestries, sculpture, objects that turn rooms into museums. He builds a hilltop complex at San Simeon that is not a house in the usual sense. It is a private statement meant to outlast the daily cycle of print. And the daily cycle does not care. Even at the height of his influence, a newspaper can be powerful while still being financially brittle. The cover price is kept low to maximize circulation. Profit is expected to arrive through ads and scale. That model works best when the economy is expanding and consumer confidence is stable. The 1930s are neither. By 1937, the pressure is no longer theoretical. It becomes administrative. That year, Hearst faces a financial crisis severe enough that control begins to change hands, not through a public collapse, but through legal structure. In June 1937, he gives up control of key pieces of the operation. His legal advisor, Clarence Shern, becomes the sole voting trustee of Hearst's stock in American newspapers. The significance of that shift is hard to exaggerate. Hearst remains Hearst in the public imagination, but inside the machinery, the lever moves away from him. The voting control of the newspapers, the ability to decide what stays, what goes, what merges, what closes, now belongs to someone whose job is not influence but survival. What follows is not a dramatic purge. It is the cold logic of reduction. The trustee begins cutting back. Some papers and radio stations are sold. One of the magazines is shut down. Real estate is liquidated. The intention is not to punish Hearst. It is to keep the system from breaking under its own weight. This is the moment when the mind machine collides with accounting, and then the empire's most symbolic assets, its visible proof of permanence, become the first to bleed. Construction and expansion at San Simeon is halted. The collecting, which once communicated inexhaustible resources, turns into inventory that can be priced, cataloged, and moved. Antiques that had been gathered to furnish a private kingdom are now seen as liquidity. Hearst still refuses, as long as possible, to do the one thing the ledger would prefer: sell off the newspapers that made him powerful. The refusal is not merely stubbornness, it is structural. If he sells the papers, he sells the instrument that has protected him for decades. The ability to pressure, to reward, to punish, to shape public atmosphere. A man who built influence through mass communication does not easily part with the thing that made him feel real. So the cuts move outward first: staff, side ventures, properties, collections. In the late 1930s, appraisers begin moving through Hearst's possessions with the method of inventory specialists, not admirers. Warehouses that once served as storage for acquisition now serve as staging grounds for sale. Thousands of items are gathered, categorized, and prepared for auctions and private deals. A private world that had been assembled as proof of scale is now dismantled in parcels. This is also when the weakness of grandeur is exposed. Objects bought for prestige do not automatically become cash in a depressed market. Art and antiques can be valuable, but value is not the same as liquidity. In the late 1930s, buyers exist, but the market is thin. Forced sales do not maximize price. They maximize survival. Hearst's life, at this point, begins to take on the quiet features of constraint. His household shrinks. The menagerie that had once made his estate feel like an old-world court is dispersed. The vast staff required to keep a private empire running is reduced. Even the basic idea of ownership changes. He is no longer simply the proprietor of a hilltop kingdom. He becomes, in practical terms, someone living inside an asset that must justify its cost. The financial reality is reinforced by the wider economy. The recession of 1937 to 1938 hits during an already fragile recovery, tightening conditions again. It becomes harder to pretend that the worst is past. For a business dependent on advertising and consumer spending, the timing is cruel. Just as restructuring begins, the environment deteriorates again. And yet the papers still print. That is part of what makes this moment so historically instructive. The public continues receiving the product, headlines, columns, certainty, while the institution producing that certainty is being reorganized behind the scenes. The country's daily narrative feels uninterrupted, even as the man most associated with it is being forced into a narrower and narrower sphere of real choice. The turning point, in other words, does not arrive as scandal. It arrives as governance. Legal agreements, trustees, forced sales, and the slow replacement of personal will with institutional oversight. Hearst can still influence what the public sees, but he is beginning to lose control of what his own empire must do to survive. And once control becomes shared, once voting power is transferred, once sales begin, once the machine is managed rather than commanded, the next step is almost inevitable. Someone finally counts the true scale of the obligations and writes the number down. There is a moment when a private empire stops behaving like an extension of one man's will and begins behaving like a governed institution. For Hearst, that moment does not arrive with disgrace. It arrives with accounting. Behind the mastheads and the public myth, the people charged with keeping the enterprise alive begin to look at the operation as a set of obligations that must be met on schedule. They stop speaking in the language of influence and start speaking in the language of exposure, what is owed, to whom, under what terms, and what happens if confidence breaks. A mass media empire can feel invulnerable because it is loud. It fills space. It makes itself unavoidable. But volume is not stability. Volume is cost. By the late 1930s, the costs are no longer hidden by momentum. Advertising markets are not generous. Credit is not sentimental. And the structure Hearst has built is not a single newspaper with a single set of books. It is a network of properties, companies, and commitments layered on top of one another, each one designed for expansion, each one demanding maintenance, each one assuming the next year will behave like the last. When that assumption fails, the empire becomes visible in a different way, heavy, intricate, and exposed to pressure from the outside. The voting trust arrangement becomes the pivot point where myth and reality separate. From the public side, Hearst remains the symbolic owner, his name still present, his legacy still spoken about, as if it were a single continuous force. From the inside, decision-making changes shape. The authority to determine what is sacrificed and what is preserved shifts toward the trustee and the advisors, whose job is not to win the next day's attention, but to prevent the system from cracking. That shift has a particular consequence. It introduces restraint into a machine designed to escalate. Newspapers thrive on pushing. Bigger headlines, stronger framing, more urgency, more drama, more claims that cannot wait for tomorrow. An attention empire is built to operate at maximum output because rivals exist, and the public's appetite is never fully satisfied. Restraint in that environment feels like weakness. But restraint is what survival requires when the financial conditions tighten. So the cuts continue, not as a single purge, but as a sequence of decisions that slowly change what the empire is. Properties are evaluated like liabilities rather than trophies. Ventures that once existed to extend reach are judged by cash flow rather than prestige. Operations are consolidated. Roles are eliminated. The empire begins to shrink into what can be defended rather than what can be dreamed. And the personal world shrinks with it. Hearst's collecting, once treated as a signature of sovereign abundance, becomes an economic instrument. Paintings, tapestries, furniture, silver, rare objects, items acquired to create an atmosphere of permanence, are now treated as saleable assets. The meaning changes, quietly but completely. These are no longer symbols. They are liquidity, or at least the closest approximation of liquidity available. Yet even that is not clean. Once a paper becomes unavoidable, the economics change. Advertising flows toward the largest crowds. Political figures begin to negotiate. Social elites begin to seek coverage or fear it. Rival institutions begin to adapt their behavior around the paper's reach. The money spent to build circulation returns as leverage, but it also creates fragility. A media empire built on scale must keep scaling. It must keep feeding the machine. It cannot easily shrink without losing the very advantage it paid to acquire. Wealth here is not the reward. It is the fuel that keeps a national attention engine running until the moment the engine becomes too expensive to control. There is a reason powerful people build large houses when their power is not guaranteed. A newspaper empire is loud, fast, and temporary by nature. It lives on the rhythm of the day. Yesterday's sensation becomes today's wrapping paper. Influence in print is real, but it is also fragile because it depends on a public that can change interests overnight. Architecture does something different. A mansion doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It simply occupies space and forces acknowledgement. It announces that the owner expects to last. It turns wealth into landscape. For Hearst, building is not decoration. It is a second language of control. An estate gathers people into a controlled environment. It creates a geography where the owner decides who enters, who sits where, what is seen, what is hidden, what is celebrated. It transforms influence from something abstract, headlines and mood, into something physical. Stone gates, long drives, elevated views, staff quarters, dining rooms designed for performance. This is the logic that culminates in the Hilltop Project at San Simeon, a private world built at extravagant scale, designed not just for comfort, but for permanence, for spectacle, for the feeling of a personal kingdom. And yet architecture carries its own truth. Colder than any newspaper editorial, it must be maintained. A press can be stopped for a day. A building must be heated, repaired, staffed, protected from weather, time, and decay. The larger the structure, the more it becomes a permanent expense, an institution in itself. So the mansion, meant to signal permanence, becomes an instrument that exposes whether permanence is real. In Hearst's world, the newspaper attempts to shape the nation's mind through daily saturation. The architecture attempts to freeze that influence into stone, making private power appear as destiny. Together, they form one coherent project: control the narrative, then build the monument. But a system built on attention and scale eventually meets a limit. Economic, political, and personal, where control stops being something you exercise and becomes something you negotiate with creditors, managers, and time itself. In the Gilded Age and its aftermath, status is not only money, it is proximity. A newspaper empire gives its owner a rare privilege: the ability to grant recognition. In a society obsessed with reputation, to be printed is to be acknowledged. To be ignored is to be reduced. To be mocked is to be weakened. And to be placed repeatedly in the public eye, framed as respectable, admirable, inevitable, is to be elevated beyond what private wealth can buy. This makes the publisher a gatekeeper in a country that claims to have no gates. The elite understand this instinctively. They may dislike the vulgarity of sensational headlines, but they still watch the front page the way financiers watch markets, because the paper does not merely report on high society. It helps define it. It can amplify a name, normalize a figure, or stain a family without ever stepping inside their parlor. For readers outside the circles of privilege, the social pages and scandal columns offer something else: a guided tour of a world otherwise sealed off. The audience learns the language of power: titles, clubs, weddings, estates, inheritances, as if studying an instruction manual written by the system itself. The paper becomes a bridge and a barrier at the same time. It lets the public look in, but it also teaches them what they are not. This is why the newspaper is more than politics. It is a maker of hierarchy. Hearst's world thrives on this. A publisher can invite, host, exclude, and display. Guests come not only for pleasure, but for the strategic value of being near the man who can shape their public story. The estate becomes an extension of the newsroom, private influence reinforcing public narrative. And the hierarchy is not maintained through threats alone. It is maintained through preference: who is praised, who is framed as tasteful, who is treated as legitimate, who is portrayed as dangerous. Over years, these signals accumulate. They become a kind of cultural weather. People behave accordingly without being explicitly instructed. This is how elite influence often works best, not as direct orders, but as ambient pressure. The most consequential thing a mass newspaper can do is not endorse a candidate. It is decide what the election is about. If the paper repeats crime and corruption, the public feels that government is rot. If it repeats foreign threat, the public feels that war is inevitable. If it repeats moral panic, the public begins to see private life as political territory. The paper becomes a tuner of national focus. In this environment, political figures learn a hard lesson. You cannot ignore the publisher. You may resist him, but you cannot behave as though he is merely one citizen. A paper with mass reach can manufacture pressure in a way that looks like public opinion because it becomes public opinion's daily source material. Hearst does not simply watch politics. He attempts to operate inside it. His relationship to elections is not only ideological, it is structural. A newspaper can create enemies and allies before a campaign begins. It can test messages in headlines. It can run moral stories that soften the public to certain arguments. It can raise doubts about rivals and make those doubts feel like common knowledge. And because the public consumes politics as story, the paper's framing often matters more than the actual legislation. This produces a particular kind of political influence, one that thrives on visibility and conflict. Political actors begin performing for the paper's attention. Institutions begin anticipating how decisions will be portrayed. Officials begin calculating not only what is legal, but what will survive in print. Here, the danger is not that the paper lies in some crude way. The danger is more subtle, that it replaces complexity with momentum, that it treats governance as spectacle, that it turns policy into drama and then rewards those who generate the most drama. A publisher who controls the agenda does not need to hold office to shape outcomes. He can destabilize reputations. He can define crises. He can normalize certain fears and delegitimize certain solutions. He can make some political futures feel ridiculous before they are attempted. This is how a media empire becomes a shadow institution, its authority unofficial, its influence constant. Every system of mass influence carries an internal contradiction. The larger it becomes, the more it costs to keep it dominant. A newspaper empire is not a fixed asset like land. It is a continuous operation. Paper costs rise. Labor costs rise. Competition intensifies. Technology changes. Advertising markets tighten. And the audience's attention, always finite, can be exhausted. This creates a reality that is often invisible in the myth-making. A publisher can appear omnipotent while becoming financially constrained, because the machine must keep running at full volume even when the balance sheet begins to weaken. If the paper shrinks, rivals gain ground. If headlines soften, circulation slips. If circulation slips, advertising weakens. If advertising weakens, the ability to sustain scale collapses. So the system encourages escalation, even when escalation is unsustainable. At a certain point, the publisher is no longer only controlling the public. He is also being controlled by the demands of the operation. He must feed it stories, staff it, fund it, expand it, defend it. He becomes the custodian of his own instrument. And then history introduces pressures that do not care about personal will. Economic downturns, shifts in political climate, shifts in technology, shifts in public taste. A communication empire built on one era's logistics can suddenly feel heavy in the next. This is where the dark story becomes less about villainy and more about inevitability. The same mechanics that allow a publisher to flood the country with narrative, scale, speed, saturation also make the empire vulnerable to any moment when money tightens and creditors begin demanding something the public never sees. Restraint. When that moment arrives, control doesn't vanish in a dramatic collapse. It becomes diluted, shared, managed, negotiated away in pieces. And this is the turning point you can almost see approaching from the start. A man who tried to shape the country's mind through a private attention machine eventually confronts the fact that a machine built to dominate others can become too large to obey its owner. The decisive shift is not a headline. It is paperwork, debt schedules, forced sales, meetings where the language is no longer influence, but solvency. That is where Hearst's story turns quietly, structurally, into the slow unwinding of control. By the mid-1930s, Hearst's empire looks, from the outside, like permanence. The papers still arrive, the headlines still land, the name still carries weight, but the mechanics underneath are changing. Selling art is not like selling stock. It requires buyers with cash and appetite. It requires time. It requires favorable conditions. And in a fragile economy, valuable does not always mean easy to convert. A forced seller does not dictate terms. A forced seller accepts them. So the process becomes incremental and relentless. Appraisals, catalogs, private negotiations, auctions, more appraisals. Rooms that were meant to overwhelm guests with density begin to thin. Storage spaces become staging areas. Objects move out not because the taste has changed, but because the enterprise must keep breathing. This is where the control Hearst once exercised over public mood begins to encounter a limit that cannot be editorialized away. He had built power through repetition and reach, by ensuring that the country's daily attention passed through outlets he could direct. But financial pressure operates on a different calendar. It is indifferent to framing. It is unmoved by reputation. It does not care that a headline can shift public anger. It cares whether payments arrive on time. In that environment, the strongest lever is no longer the front page. It is the legal document. Decisions become procedural. Meetings become consequential in the ways that never appear in print. The language of the enterprise turns technical. Terms about voting rights, control, sales, covenants, and stability. The empire that once felt like a personal instrument starts to feel like a machine being kept alive by technicians. And inside that change is the clearest irony of Hearst's entire arc. The man most associated with shaping the public's perception begins living inside a reality he cannot shape with perception. He can still speak. He can still influence. He can still be powerful in the way a legacy is powerful, through habit, memory, fear, and the size of his name. But the decisive power has shifted to governance, to oversight, to the slow, methodical conversion of an expansion-driven empire into something that can endure without collapsing. By 1940, the transformation is effectively complete. The papers continue to print, which is exactly what makes the shift so easy to miss. To the public, the continuity of output suggests continuity of control. The product is still there, so the maker must still be sovereign. But sovereignty is no longer the correct word. The enterprise has become managed rather than commanded. It operates under supervision designed to protect creditors and preserve what can be preserved. Hearst's authority is no longer absolute within his own structure. It is limited, negotiated, and constrained by the terms of survival. This is the turning point the story has been approaching since the moment mass circulation became a weapon, the instant when a private attention empire grows so large that it stops obeying the person who built it. Not because the public turns on him overnight, not because a rival defeats him in a single battle, but because the system he created requires conditions, money, confidence, constant motion, that no one individual can guarantee forever. The mind machine remains, but it belongs, increasingly, to the institution that must keep it alive. And once that happens, the final question is no longer what Hearst can make the country feel tomorrow. It is what remains when the empire's daily output continues. After the man who once directed it can no longer decide what it costs. After the transfer of real control, the most important change is not what disappears, it is what persists. The Hearst name remains on the public surface of American life. Newspapers still arrive with the same authority of routine. Columns still speak with certainty. The institution still occupies attention the way a large building occupies a street. People root themselves around it without thinking, but the empire's internal logic has shifted. A privately driven machine can afford to be irrational for long stretches, spending heavily to win prestige, keeping unprofitable assets for strategic reach, escalating conflicts because escalation itself is power. A managed institution cannot. Once the goal becomes continuity rather than conquest, every part of the system is forced to justify itself. That change rewrites the organization in quiet ways. The operation becomes leaner, some titles vanish, some markets are abandoned. The network loses the feeling of endless expansion and takes on the texture of maintenance. It keeps the parts that reliably produce revenue and trims the parts that exist mainly to express personality. The public might not register the difference immediately because the product, news, still has the same form. It still comes daily. It still feels urgent. But inside the enterprise, the priorities have shifted away from domination and toward balance. And when balance becomes the priority, the newsroom changes, not necessarily in tone, because tone can still be useful, but in strategy. The paper is no longer being driven by a single proprietor's appetite for fight and spectacle. It is being driven by administrators who must answer to ledgers. The empire can still pursue influence, but influence is no longer allowed to threaten solvency. This is what happens to many Gilded Age fortunes when they outgrow the era that created them. They become institutional. The wealth remains, but the personality drains out. The original ambition is preserved only where it can be made safe. For Hearst, that institutionalization extends beyond the papers. The private world that once functioned like a parallel court, the estates, the collecting, the architecture as declaration, cannot remain intact under the new logic. The hilltop property at San Simeon does not disappear, but it changes meaning. It becomes less a kingdom and more a cost center that must be contained. The rooms remain, the views remain, the scale remain, but the aura of unlimited expansion does not. Work halts. Staff shrinks. The routines of a place built for spectacle become quieter, more practical. The estate begins to feel less like a project still ascending and more like a finished artifact being preserved. The collecting, too, enters a different phase. Once the great dispersal begins, it leaves behind absence as evidence. Rooms once designed to overwhelm with density of objects now reveal architecture more clearly. The emptier a space becomes, the more it tells the truth, that the objects were never simply decoration, they were proof of capacity. And when that proof is sold away, what remains is the structure and the record of what it cost. Yet the paradox of Hearst's legacy is that the system still works. Even diminished, even managed, even stripped of the most extravagant outer layers, the Hearst operation continues because the underlying American conditions that created it do not vanish. The country still consumes news as daily weather. Advertising still follows crowds. Politics still responds to attention. The public still prefers urgency to complexity, especially in moments of fear. So the empire does not die. It consolidates. The difference is that it no longer belongs to one man's imagination. It belongs to the logic of an institution trying to stay alive in a changed world. That shift has consequences for influence itself. A privately commanded paper can treat enemies personally and pursue vendettas with reckless persistence. A managed institution tends to be more cautious, less theatrical in its internal priorities. even if the public-facing product still uses theatrical tools. It becomes harder to run the entire machine as an extension of ego. In that sense, the aftermath is not a collapse, but a conversion. Hearst's greatest creation, the capacity to shape attention at scale, survives him as a structure, not as a personality. It becomes something the country continues to interact with even when the original force behind it has been reduced to a name and a memory, and that is the quietest form of consequence. The system outliving the person who believed he controlled it. Because once an empire becomes institutional, its final transformation is almost inevitable. Over time, the private symbol at its center, the great estate, the great statement, stops being private at all. It becomes public history. When private power becomes too large to be sustained privately, its most visible symbols tend to survive in a new form, not as kingdoms, as exhibits. San Simeon was built to feel above ordinary time, a hilltop complex meant to declare permanence, the kind of place designed so that guests would remember it as an atmosphere, not just a house. Stone, height, distance from the road, the sense that the world below was smaller than the owner's view. But permanence is expensive, and eventually, permanence has to find a funding model. By the 1950s, the logic that had been tightening for years reaches its cleanest conclusion. The estate does not continue as an endlessly staffed private world. It transitions into a managed public site. In 1958, it is dedicated as a state historical monument and opened to tours, an engineered transformation from personal statement to public asset. The change is not only administrative, it changes the meaning of the place. A private estate is designed to control access. A public monument is designed to process visitors. The same architecture that once served as a gate now becomes a route. The same rooms that once enforced hierarchy now become stops in a guided sequence. The same objects that once signaled private dominance become interpretive material, labeled, explained, placed inside a narrative of an era. The hilltop that once performed authority now performs history. This is the late-stage fate of many Gilded Age projects. What began as personal empire ends as institutional memory. The public comes not to pledge loyalty, but to look, to learn, to consume a curated version of the past. And yet, even this does not fully neutralize the original purpose, because the estate still communicates what it was built to communicate: scale, ambition, and the assumption of entitlement. You cannot walk its terraces without feeling the original logic embedded in the design, that wealth was expected to be obeyed, that taste was expected to justify power, that the private life of the elite was meant to be a form of public instruction. Now, however, the instruction is different. Visitors do not receive the message as command. They receive it as evidence. They see how much labor was required to maintain a private world. Staff quarters, service routes, kitchens, storage, repairs. They see that the grandeur depends on the invisible. They see how easily permanence becomes fragile when the economic system that supports it shifts. The same truth applies to Hearst's media legacy. Over time, the public stops experiencing his empire as a singular will and begins experiencing it as part of the American landscape, something large, normalized, institutional. In that form, the empire's influence becomes less personal and therefore harder to argue with directly. It is no longer Hearst's voice so much as the way the system works. This is the most enduring aftermath, not the survival of one man's reputation, but the survival of the method. The method is simple and it scales. Make the public feel urgency. Compress complexity into moral clarity. Repeat the framing until it becomes environmental. Convert attention into leverage. The estate on the hill becomes a museum because museums are one of the few institutions capable of maintaining such scale without pretending it is a private right. And in that transition, the story completes its arc. The symbols of private control remain, but they change owners, change purpose, and change meaning. power tries to look permanent. History teaches it to become public. The end of the story. Hearst's story is often told as a personality. An heir with a paper, a publisher with a temper, a man who believed the country could be moved the way a newsroom moves a headline. But the deeper truth is less personal and more enduring. He was born into a moment when America's systems made a new kind of power possible. Not power through law or force or office, but power through attention. Cheap paper, fast wire, dense cities, advertising markets. Daily routines that train millions of people to receive reality from the same printed surface each morning. In that environment, controlling America's mind does not require hypnosis. It requires logistics. It requires the ability to decide what enters the public field of vision, how it is framed, and how often it returns, until it feels like the weather, present, unavoidable, and beyond argument. It requires turning emotion into a repeatable product, then delivering it at scale. Hearst did that with the confidence of an era that assumed expansion was destiny. And then the era changed. The irony is quiet. The very scale that made his influence possible also made it fragile. The empire became too expensive to remain purely personal. The machinery that once extended his will began requiring oversight, restraint, and governance. The attention engine outgrew the man who built it. What survives is not his certainty or his taste, or even the precise arguments his papers printed. What survives is the method. The idea that public life can be shaped without formal authority, simply by managing what people see first, what they repeat, and what they fear. The idea that a nation can be guided not only by policy, but by atmosphere, by the daily temperature of headlines. His hilltop estate eventually becomes a public monument, not because it stopped mattering, but because private permanence is rarely sustainable. Wealth builds, time audits. Institutions inherit what individuals cannot hold. That is the final lesson of Hearst's dark story. Influence is easiest to mistake for ownership. A man can flood the country with narrative and still lose control of the machine that produces it. And when the machine outlives the man, it becomes part of the landscape, quietly shaping the next generation long after the original voice has gone silent.